Would you like to send your children to private school, but on the taxpayer's dime? I'm Sarah, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. Today, we'll have our first in a new series of discussions, casting a spotlight on some of the key policies from Project 2025, the conservative playbook for the next president. To begin, we're diving into the world of education policy, with a focus on Project 2025's plan to expand education savings accounts, or ESAs. With us today, once again, is Stephen.
Hi, Sarah. Another great topic for us here to talk about.
I feel like before we get into this, I would love to just take a brief moment to talk about our different educational experiences. You were born in the UK, raised in the UK. Mm-hmm. I was born in Colorado, but I also actually went to high school in Spain. So I feel like I got some pretty interesting looks at what could be different in education. And I definitely have some opinions about how my school was in Spain. So I'd love to ask how kind of your school was, how you learned, like what did a normal school day look? Because I found the difference between my school in Colorado and my school in Spain very different.
It is, but people don't realize, because everybody just tends to experience an education system in their one country, in their own country. They don't realize quite how different it is. But every country in the world has a radically different education system that works in all sorts of different ways. And a lot of it tends to stem from how it began. So the way the American education system began is actually quite an interesting tale in and of itself, actually. But it's about these covered wagons wandering around the country, everyone taking these books and setting up these little house on the prairie type schools and things. But in the UK, it was the churches that set up the schools, and that's how our education system began. So for a long time, the only way to learn to read and write or learn anything at all was through the church. And obviously they would also teach you about God at the same time, but then they would also teach you some basic education. And when the Industrial Revolution happened and the government realized we needed an education system so that people had the basic skills to be able to go and work in factories and things, they co-opted that religious education system from the schools, which means that our education system is very religious in a lot of ways. So a lot of our schools are religious schools. Every area has Protestant schools, it has Catholic schools, it may well have Muslim schools, Jewish schools, Hindu schools. So all religions are allowed to set up their own schools, which are publicly funded. So they are state schools, they're subject to the same rules, same inspection regime, all of that kind of stuff. But they teach within the context of religion. And that's, I think, one of the really big differences, because obviously in America, separation of church and state, you're absolutely not allowed to have state-funded schools that are religious in nature, but here you do.
And tell that to Louisiana.
But all of my schools, well, they're trying, aren't they? But it's something that we've always had. And in fact, I mean, something that may shock Americans as well is that one of the rules for all schools in Britain is that they must have a collective act of worship at the beginning of each day. So there's a school assembly which involves prayer. Which, considering that Britain is a very secular country now, is quite an oddity, really. But it is just a hangover from these days when schools were effectively all religious. They were all set up by churches.
Yeah, one other interesting tidbit. Did you know that I am a direct descendant of Laura's Ingalls Wilder from Little House on the Prairie?
Are you? Wow. Well,
I know. That's claim to fame over here.
Yes.
Yeah, like on my grandmother's side, I was doing in school a family tree, and my mom was helping me because she's a very involved mom growing up, and we were doing this family tree, and my mom is going back in it, and she turns to my dad, and she's like, "Wait a second. Did you know that you are?" And my dad had no idea because he's never read those books. Like, he was like, "Little House on the Prairie, who?" Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
One of those shows that everybody knows. I mean, even over here, people watched Little House on the Prairie. It was just one of those shows, I think, that all over the world.
No, absolutely. And what's also interesting is, for me, the biggest kind of shock that I had when I went from my US school to a Spain school is, at my US school, I felt like, honestly, that there was a little bit higher attention paid to actually teaching and like having teaching materials and those kinds of things. I had such a hard time learning in Spain. Maybe it was because it wasn't a language I didn't yet speak, but my schools in the US, where auto visual, like, you know, we would do activities, we would do workshops, like all of these different types of ways so that all different types of learners could learn. And my school in Spain, I sat in one desk and the teachers moved around, which is in the US, you move to classrooms and teachers have their own classrooms. And they just lectured on a chalkboard. Like, there wasn't a projector, there wasn't a whiteboard, like,
Really?
and they just stood up there and talked at us for 45 minutes, and everybody's writing like perfect penmanship notes, like verbatim of what everyone was saying, and then like the next teacher would cycle in, and I was like, how does anybody learn anything here? Like, I find myself to be a pretty traditional learner, and like that was the hardest learning year of my life, and I got very lucky that I was able to audit a couple of, like, you know, philosophy and the language course, because I was like, I don't know if I can figure out about an adverb in Spanish when I don't even know what the word adverb in Spanish means. So, but it was pretty jarring.
So how old were you when you were in Spain?
I was there for my junior year of high school, so I was 17. And yeah, I mean, what was interesting is, so I was in like the part where you're specializing in Europe, and so I was in the humanities track, and so I had history, philosophy, you know, the lengua castellano, those kinds of things. But it was interesting because I also took like economics, and that was my math class, and it was cool. I really liked it. You know, obviously we don't have that specialist track that you were talking about just the last episode. And so I did really like that, but it was also hilarious because I was like, I absolutely do not have the level of Spanish to be learning about philosophy.
No. I mean, well, when I was at university, I actually spent some time in Spain at a Spanish university, supposedly studying philosophy in Spanish.
Supposedly.
The one problem, I didn't speak any Spanish, so instead they just sort of said, go away and don't bother us for 3 months, and then give us a good review at the end. So we just went off and drank gin and tonics for 3 months and had a good time. So.
You know,
I have a very positive experience with Spanish education.
Yeah, I also went to a year of college in Spain, and it was interesting because, you know, also there was 4 years apart when I went to high school and college, and I do feel like my college was a little bit more like educating in the way that I was used to being educated to. Wow, it's good education I have there. But I think, you know, one thing that I did find really interesting, and kind of to what you were talking about earlier, is, yeah, I never had like a single religious thing in any of my school growing up. And then the school that I went to in Spain for high school was the like dirty public school that nobody wanted to go to, because we had a whole bunch of private schools in my town, and like the host family I lived with, all of their kids went to the private school. And then, you know, I was an exchange student, so I had to go to the public school. And it was really crazy because my sister was at a Catholic school, and what she was learning and what she was doing was so different from, you know, me trying to get through philosophy. But even in college, though, there was not one semblance of religion at my university. It was pretty, I mean, you could take a religion class, of course, you know, you could do that at my school in the States, too.
It can be problematic. I understand why in America you don't have religious schools. And I quite approve of that. I don't think schools should be teaching religion. I don't think it's the purpose of a state school to teach a particular religion, which they do in a certain extent. But they do have to sort of follow pretty much the same curriculum as everybody else, because everybody takes the same exams at the end. So it sort of forces schools to teach the same thing. I used to work for the Department for Education. I was working on sort of science education policy. And one of the things we did is we made sure that in the rules for every single school, regardless of whether they're religion or not, there are certain things that they have to teach, and certain things they're not allowed to teach. So they have to teach the theory of evolution. They're not allowed to teach anything that is anything akin to sort of creationism or intelligent design or those kind of things, not within sort of science lessons. So we set certain parameters because there is obviously a concern that some schools wouldn't do that. And then we
Yeah.
did come across some schools that wouldn't do that, some quite orthodox schools that just wouldn't teach evolution. And then in the exams at the end, they'd go through and like cross out all the evolution questions and not let their kids answer them
Wow.
and things. So it's quite strange.
Well, that is very interesting. And I feel like that
Not many
actually,
schools like that, luckily.
well, and I feel like that actually goes perfectly into these ESAs and what we'll talk about next week, the Parental Bill of Rights, of kids having different levels of education because of parents trying to change either the schooling that's happening due to their values or what they want their kids being taught, or, you know, change the curricula to be teaching creationism instead of evolution, and that the standards of people's education is going to be changing if we don't actually have standards anymore. So I think with that, let's get back to it. So I hear this could radically change the education system in the US. First up, what exactly is Project 2025?
Absolutely, yes. It's quite radical in a lot of ways. So, Project 2025 is formally known as the Mandate for Leadership: The Conservative Promise, and it's a detailed playbook crafted by the Heritage Foundation, a very well-known conservative organisation. It's a very hefty 800-page document which outlines a comprehensive plan for the first 180 days of a potential second Trump administration. It's essentially a conservative wish list for reshaping government policy across all areas and government departments. They realized basically that during the last Trump presidency, Trump got off to quite a slow start and didn't do very much at the beginning. So they realized that the first 180 days should be the most productive of any presidency. So they wanted to avoid that slow start and make sure that a second Trump presidency would hit the ground running and make sure that they get all of these policies enacted.
Wow, 800 pages. That sounds like they have a lot to say and even more planned. What are the key focuses of Project 2025?
Well, according to Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation, the next Conservative president should focus on four main areas: restoring the family as the centerpiece of American life, dismantling the administrative state, defending national sovereignty, and securing individual freedoms. But today, we're particularly zeroing in on their plan for education, and one part of that, which is the expansion of education saving accounts, or ESAs.
I feel like ESAs have been a really hot topic lately. I have been hearing about them a lot, and I do not have children, and I'm not really engaged with anybody going to school or anything like that. My friends who have kids, you know, they're like under 3 years old. So for our listeners who might not be familiar, kind of like myself, I've heard a lot about them, heard them talked about a lot, but can you give us a quick rundown on what exactly they are?
Sure. So education saving accounts allow parents to take public money allocated for their child's education and use it to cover various educational expenses, which could include private school tuition, homeschooling, materials, tutoring, and a range of other things as well. So it's all about giving parents more control over their child's education. Now, it's important to distinguish them from voucher schemes, which just allow state funds to be used to pay for private school education for certain kids, usually kids from lower income backgrounds, actually, to give them those opportunities that richer kids have in private schools. The voucher schemes have historically run into constitutional problems because private schools are very often religious in nature, and states tend to prohibit the use of public funds for religious education.
That sounds like it could be empowering for parents, but like everything these days, I feel like there's some opinions on both sides. What's kind of the history behind these ESA accounts?
Yes, absolutely. They can be extremely controversial, and where they've been introduced, there have been long-running battles, both legal and just generally conceptual, about whether they should be allowed or not. But the concept isn't new. So one of the earliest and most notable voucher programs started in Milwaukee in 1989, way back then, aimed at helping low-income families. And that's still running. It's been quite successful. But the real push for ESAs began in Arizona in 2011. So they'd already tried to introduce voucher schemes, which had been blocked, but they sidestepped the legal issues by giving funds directly to parents rather than schools, which allowed them to avoid those restrictions on using public money for religious education.
Interesting. I feel like we're going to be talking a lot about Arizona legislation when we're tracing back some of these initiatives in 2025. The piece I just read about the Parental Bill of Rights also traces back to Arizona, but more on that when we cover it next time. Have other states followed suit to Arizona. Is this all kind of driven between voucher programs not being allowed to use for religious reasons? What are states doing when it comes to this?
Yeah, so by setting up ESAs rather than a voucher program and sort of circumventing the legal issues, Arizona really were a trailblazer for other states as well. And there are many, many states now that have these ESA programs of one form or another. So states like Florida and Nevada, which have created their own versions. Florida, for example, has what's called the Gardiner Scholarship Program for students with disabilities. I should say ESA programs are often begin for students with disabilities that often need very specific type of education that they tend not to be able to get at their local sort of state-funded public school. They need special tuition, and parents that can't afford that, these ESA programs can often help with that. So it's obviously a good thing. Nevada has introduced the Universal ESA program, which has faced some legal hurdles.
What kind of legal hurdles?
Well, in Nevada's case, it was to do with the funding mechanism they chose. So there's a very fine line between what's a voucher and what's an ESA. And when the Supreme Court's weighed in, as they did in Nevada, they'll often say, "Oh, you can sort of do this, but you're not quite allowed to do that. So you're going to need to make some changes," which is what they're sort of doing at the moment, really. But the Nevada Supreme Court did rule, though, that the concept in general was constitutional. But the ESA programs have proven to be highly controversial, sort of more broadly than that. So in Arizona, for example, I mean, again, let's sort of look at Arizona because it is one of the longest running schemes. CNN did an investigation a while back where they looked into how the program actually works and where the money's going and so on. So another issue with some of these that people often criticize is that they're not very transparent in terms of how the money is spent. So large chunks of public money are assigned to an ESA program, and then there's very little information about where it goes. So CNN did some digging, and they found out that their programs in just 1 year ballooned from $64.5 million to $332 million, partly because a lot of the kids who were benefiting were already in private education, and so this therefore constituted an additional burden on the system because all of a sudden the public system was funding all of these sort of state educated, privately educated kids. What they also found is that wealthier communities took a disproportionate share of the funds. And all of these together have raised sort of real concerns about the equity and the budget strains. So why is it that a quite large chunks of the public education bill is going to sort of wealthier parents who actually before this were just funding their kids to go to private schools themselves?
That's really interesting. I feel like we've been seeing that a lot lately with these programs that have been introduced to really try to lift people up and support people when they need it, like the PPP loans, and how people figured out how to take advantage of those. And as you said, these have a good origin in trying to help people with disabilities get access to better education for themselves. But here we are with people gaming what they can, so that's unfortunate.
It's true, and also one of the prime accusations that's leveled at these schemes is that it's just effectively a way to allow conservative parents to send their kids to sort of highly conservative Christian schools, which cost a lot of money, but actually funding them through taxpayers' money. And what the CNN research did find was that about half of the ASA money went to religious schools, and these tended to be highly conservative Christian schools. And so that does bring up the whole church and state debate and whether it's actually right for public money to be used to fund such education.
Yeah, that seems very problematic. Have any states really nailed it with ESAs, or?
Well, there is. I mean, we should say that Texas is a good example of this. So Governor Greg Abbott is very, very keen on ESAs, and he's been trying for many years to introduce them. And obviously Texas, a very Republican state with broad support for such measures, but he's failed to introduce them over a number of years now. In fact, last year there were 4 special sessions, an unprecedented 4 special sessions in Texas, largely around trying to push through ESA schemes, and they all failed. And the reason they failed is that Republican representatives in rural areas of Texas wouldn't vote for them, regardless of what he said, regardless of how he tried to persuade them. And their concerns are around that these schemes will take money from public schools and in rural Texas, areas of rural Texas, the public schools are very, very important. They're like community hubs and so on. And so these representatives aren't willing to risk in their districts having money pulled out of these sort of very important sort of social hubs. And so they're not convinced. He tried very, very hard in the various bills to put extra money into public school and to reassure them that this wouldn't detract from the public school system, but they weren't convinced.
Yeah, I feel like that really speaks to what I see as the issue here of when you're taking money out of the public system, how are people that are reliant on that system going to make up for that? And that seems, very unfair to say the least. And also, those people who it's getting taken away from, I'm assuming, will have a lower quality of education. Is there any studies or anything like that to support that taking that money out of the public system and putting it into programs like this is improving the academic performance of students, or what does that look like?
Well, that's a really, really important question, isn't it? Because the whole point of this, according to the people who actually push these programs, is that they improve educational attainment. So kids get better education where you have this additional choice and you're able to spend money on what parents want to spend it on. And parents are saying, we know best what's good for our kids. If we can spend the money, then they will get a better education. But the research around this has actually been very lackluster. So some studies have shown very modest academic gains for students using ESAs. So there was a study in Florida, for example, that showed it slightly increased college enrollments. But there was other research, like the research from Stanford, that found no significant improvement in test scores overall. And places like Indiana and Louisiana, students have actually struggled academically. So they've been worse off before catching up.
So you could maybe say it's a bit of a gamble. And with Project 2025 aiming to expand ESAs, are there any particular areas that they're targeting?
Yes, so they've looked at all the ways that education is funded and controlled via the Department of Education. And they've targeted, in particular, transforming education for students in active duty military families, where the government has direct control over that. Those in DC, again, where the government controls it, and students on tribal lands. And so they said the government should aim to turn these into model systems by giving every student the opportunity of using one of these ESAs. They also want to change major federal education laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to allow for ESAs, along with a variety of other mechanisms. So basically just making it much easier for states to implement these programs, and in fact making it unlikely that they wouldn't do that because the system is set up in a way that should facilitate these ESAs.
That sounds ambitious. But given the mixed results and legal challenges, is such a massive expansion really justified?
Well, again, that's the key question, isn't it? Advocates do argue that more choice will drive up education quality and efficiency, even if the evidence isn't quite there yet. But the critics, of course, say that it just exacerbates inequalities, it diverts funds from already underfunded public school systems. And there's concerns really over transparency and accountability, especially if these funds are used for private or religious education, and there isn't a really clear way to monitor and control exactly how the money is being spent.
It sounds like a lot hinges on the actual implementation of what they see the future to be. With Project 2025 aiming to eliminate the Federal Department of Education, how can we expect robust safeguards that can actually make the implementation go well and actually have us see the positives that we could see from something like this?
Well, that does seem unlikely, doesn't it? Eliminating the Department of Education, it has to mean that there is less oversight and fewer safeguards. And without strong regulations and transparency, which has definitely been lacking in the programs that exist out there already, there is a risk that ESAs just widen the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students.
So, Stephen, in your opinion, is Project 2025 right to be pushing for this expansion?
Well, in theory, giving parents more control over their child's education is a good thing. I mean, all the studies around the world show that where parents take an active interest in their child's education, the kids do better. But given the current challenges and the very mixed results from these schemes so far, a nationwide expansion of ESAs without thorough research and robust safeguards could be really problematic. I mean, effectively, it's a complicated issue that needs more scrutiny and balanced policy making.
Absolutely. It seems like there's a lot more to discuss here. Thanks for breaking it down. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe to stay updated. We'll be doing more coverage of other Project 2025 initiatives. Until next time.
Thanks, Sarah. See you next time, everybody.